got like Jesus. I don't know why, but whenever I wear this, I'm always like, it's giving I'm a disciple of Jerusalem. But yeah. I love watching 24-hour reading challenges because I love to see how much people can really like fit into them. They are, however, a little bit of a bane of my existence because I try to do them sometimes, like just by myself. I'm like 24 hours of reading, let's see how it goes. And then that was meant to be hard, but I fucked that. Anyway, I get sleepy. I get so sleepy. I'm a sleepy little girl by the time it's like 6:30, 7 o'clock. And I know you can sleep, but like I want to keep going. I'm like 24 hours of reading. Like I never thought of the fact that you could like sleep for 3 hours. So I'm just like, I'm trying to power through. And then at 6:30 in the morning, I'm like, I want to sleep. I want to sleep right now. I want to fall asleep right the fuck now. And it doesn't work. So I want to try doing a 24-hour reading challenge to read the Poppy Wall series, but I want to do it over like a week. I want to see if I can do it over like 7 days and see how much I read of all of it. It's pretty long though, so I feel like I might not be able to do it, but I feel like I can, right? A big part of it is that I'm going to listen to the audiobook as I read them. I think this is going to really help. I listen to my audiobooks really fast. Like I listen to them in like 2.5 speed, and this can probably get me to like 24 hours considering I think all of them are around like 8 hours. That is a little drawing close to the finish line. 8 hours sort of is, 3 8-hour audiobooks is 24 hours. So, you can't take many breaks. You'd have to like really consistently do it. But I think I could do it. I think I could do it. Especially because I really want to read the series. I loved Babel by R.F. Kuang. So this is something that I've been wanting to read for ages. Like I talked about reading this series in my mid-year freak out tag video. So I'm trying to get around to actually doing it. It's 3 books. I don't really read a lot of fantasy these days just because it takes me ages. So yeah, hopefully I like it. Hopefully it goes well. Hopefully I really don't screw this up and I really like it. So So I'm like 200 pages into the Poppy Wall now, and I really like it, okay? I think it's great. But the one thing I always forget when I'm reading fantasy is just like how much I like fantasy. Like I always think that I'm not gonna like it, not because I don't like fantasy, I'm a big fantasy girly. I just don't want to read that much because like you can't read one, right? You have to read like all 4 of the series, because if you read one and you're like, okay, I'm gonna do something else, I'm gonna read like 4 of the books before I read the next one, it's like you're gonna forget what happens in the first book because they're all interlinked. If you read a contemporary novel, there's one book, you finish it and you're done. You don't have to like remember things. But with a fantasy novel, like you need to keep making sure that you understand all the characters. You need to know what the actual like fantasy lore is, and if you forget, like you're a bit screwed, because really like what are you really meant to take from that? Not anything. So 200 pages into this, I'm like, oh my god, I really want to just keep reading. Like I keep forgetting that that's like how I interact with fantasy, because before, I've been reading a lot of contemporary novels and I don't really have that like energy towards contemporary novels. I don't think I have this thing of like, let's just keep reading. Like I've never been like exhausted and I'm like, let's keep reading because I really want to know what happens next. Like I'm more like, oh, I want to see how this character develops, I want to know how this situation ends, but I'm never like, oh my god, I need to know what happens because like this is so intriguing. Like I feel like a lot of, maybe it's just me because I don't like that genre as much as I like fantasy, even though I don't read fantasy as much because of the time commitment and just the general commitment you need to have to it, because there's no way you can sort of dip in and out of it, for me at least, because I just don't have that much like space to store everything. But yeah, I'm just like so interested to find out what Rin and the Academy and like what's going to happen, because currently we don't really have an issue. We don't actually have any fantasy. I think this is a fantasy book, but I could be wrong, since there's actually no fantasy. There's more 200 pages in. There's like ideas of fantasy, but there's not like actually any fantasy yet. I'll just have to see how that goes. But yeah, I'm so excited because like I have not read anything that's high fantasy in a while, and I want to see what the problem is, because right now we haven't actually established any problems. It's sort of like, we're in this situation and we think that there's gonna be a problem because these kind of situations, these kind of books always have like a corrupt government or etc, but we don't actually know what the issue is yet. So I'm excited to see what the problem is going to be, because we've only kind of tangentially seen and sort of touched upon what the evil is. I mean, they did say that the current government genocided an entire nation, so I assume it's going to be something to do with that. I already really like Rin. She's kind of obnoxious, but I kind of like that. I don't mind that. Her being 16, I forget like young adult and like the level of competence young adults seem to have, because, well, I was an idiot at 16 and I'm older now, and reading YA when you're 16, you're like, well, of course I could do that. Whereas like reading YA at 22, you're like, well, I don't know if I would do that. I don't know if I would burn myself to make sure I did my GCSEs, like that's simply not the move. I'm really comparing the Academy to like all the people who are like so obsessed with like going to Cambridge. Like that's very clearly the vibe. And obviously I've read Babel by R.F. Kuang, so I'm seeing like a little bit of like an academic sort of like struggle for academia concept here, which clearly is something that she loves. I've not read Yellowface yet, but yeah, I'm massively enjoying this. I did like Babel a lot, so I knew I would like this, but obviously a lot of people have said this is perhaps a little weaker in writing than that is, but obviously again, this is the first book. I assume the sort of like cracks in that entire thing come later, because I think it's more of like a I don't know, people are just like, it's not as great, it falls at some points, and even though that's probably going to happen, I'm very excited to see where this goes now. Okay, so I'm now 5 hours into reading and around 500 pages into the book. I've had to stop reading because it's gone graphic in a way that I was expecting it. I knew I was. I feel like whenever people talk about death, I'm not as like concerned. Like, death is not something that like actively plays a part in my life, so I'm just like, whatever. Not whatever, but I'm also like, you know, I come from a war-torn country. I've seen war on the news every day. War is war, you know, and like if you go into a book called The Poppy War, you're gonna be like, well, some war is gonna happen. But like, I don't know if I can say this. I mean, my channel is not monetized, obviously, but like they started like the opposition war. Okay, oh yeah, so I didn't say last time, but like the war has started, like the war has broken out, and we know who like the evil for this time being is. I feel like there is like a worse evil, considering there is like a fantasy element to this, and the current like opposition army aren't currently really using magic. No one's really properly using magic yet. Like they are kind of, but not really. So I don't think like we're going to get into that until maybe the end of this book. But currently like the opposition army we're sort of being described how they've are worded. I don't know, I don't want to say the whole word. I don't know if this will get flagged for that. I don't care. I only have like 700 subscribers. How are they going to flag me for this? But yeah, like the opposition army is fully R-wording all the women, and one of the women who this happens to is sort of like recounting this happening to the main character. The main character like ends up in a place where the opposition army has sort of like pillaged through, and we get told this. And all I can think of is that one book that was written about the Japanese army, and how the Japanese army essentially like mutilated a lot of women, and just like all of these sort of like sex crimes. Again, I don't know if I can say that. Crimes that were committed during the war to a lot of women, and I literally cannot read this. Like all I can remember is like that book that was written. It's like one researcher, she sort of like compiled all this information that she found from sources about all these women that were like attacked during this war. She basically says like all of these horrible things happened, and like she commits suicide, like the writer of that book, and like that's all I can think about. Like when I'm reading this, all I can think about is that one writer's suicide, and I'm like, wow. Clearly I feel like this is just, I mean, it happens in all wars, I guess, like it's a big thing in many wars. But yeah, like death, you know, like I feel like in a book like this you kind of get acclimatized to it. I think as a woman I'm never going to be acclimatized to hearing about mass R-wording in this way. Like it's genuinely like it makes me feel sick, because it's like one of the only things where I'm like, I mean obviously like this is like a hate crime and genocide, and I'm like, well, you know, genocide is not justified in any way, but R-wording is just like so visceral. And oh my god, like it's happened to a character that we met earlier on in the story, and she's telling us how this happened to her, to the main character, and it's just like, oh my god, I feel like actually ill that this is happening. I finished reading The Poppy War, so I picked it up again. I sort of soldiered through kind of like how horrible the place where I last left off was, and I sort of just like kept reading, I didn't stop. And it's finished now. The book is like 580 pages. I'm like 6 hours, 40 minutes in, and I'm like, how am I going to finish this in 24 hours? Like, I don't think that's like feasible, all things considered, but we'll see. I think the biggest thing for me is just like the ending was just like not what I was expecting, because it's really brutal, but like not in the way that I thought. Like it's not like a visceral brutality where you're like feeling it. You're not feeling like empathy for the people who die in the war, because like it's not happening in front of you. A lot of the stuff that does feel perhaps a bit more realistic, or the stuff that really it feels like it's punched to the gut, are things that are happening like to or around or being told directly to the main character. And the big like thing that happens at the end of the Poppy War doesn't really happen to Rin, so it doesn't like feel like you're feeling the impact of it just yet, but I assume that will be like the case at some point in the next book. There's not that many deaths of people that are close by, and I think there are some people who are going to come back. Like there's one character that's like dead, but like everything points to the fact that this character is like not dead. Like everything is saying that this person will be back in the next book. So I'm well excited for that person to come back, because I think they're one of my favorite characters, even though they were kind of a dick in the beginning of the book. The fantasy element being so volatile and just something that like you can't control is very interesting. Like there's no sense of learning and improving at the magic system, which is interesting because I feel like in a lot of magic systems it's this idea that like if you keep at it, if you keep going, you actually can get better at it, and that doesn't really seem to be the case with the gods in this, and that is really interesting because it kind of just means anything can happen. It's not like, okay, so if we do a massive like training montage, Rocky style. I think it's written well, and I do think though, when people read Babel and they were like, it's written so much better than this, I do get why they say that. Obviously there is this like disparity, what is the thing where it's like, there's a bit of a gap in between both of them, and that's because obviously Babel is an adult, or it's like new adult, but like new adult kind of insinuates this idea of sexual relations, and there's none of that in Babel. It's more just like brutality, and the characters are a bit older, obviously they're in uni, so they're like 2021, whereas like this is firmly YA. I think this is the most brutal YA I've ever read though. Like I've never seen this much close up horrific things happen in any other YA, regardless of the fact they're like 50 million, okay, no YA has a 50 million death count, but like it'll be like 20,000 people died. You don't feel it the way I guess you felt some of the deaths here, because like they really describe the ways they died, and it seems to be like close combat deaths for some of the, like the worser deaths. Some of the ones that you don't see are the ones that are like nearer the end, and you're like, you don't know how to process that because you don't get that like full extent of how they die. Like they die off screen essentially. Whereas the ones who sort of like you really see die are the ones that really hit you. But like it's definitely not adult in the way that it writes, but it's also kind of adult in its themes because of how harsh everything is. So it's like an interesting mix there, but I do definitely think this is written in a way that is perhaps not like to the standard of Babel, because when I was reading Babel I felt like it was so well written and like scholarly. I get that, I guess it's like the theme they want you to believe, but you know, that's what Babel's about. Like it felt scholarly. Even this though, I think some of the things I'm like reading, I'm like, oh, I doubt that this specific author like R.F. Kuang is gonna sort of allow sort of like little cracks to fall with this idea of like the opposition like not being seen as people, because every side of a war, if there's like innocent people on each side of the war, I can't imagine like R.F. Kuang being okay with like killing an opposition, because they are like people, and she has like a sense of morality to her writing that I guess I would expect because I've read Babel. So I am excited to see how that morality comes here. But again, just like Babel, I am massively left whilst reading this, or just anything to do with war, but this specifically because it depicts quite clearly the brutality of war. To read Frantz Fanon, I'm always left with this sense of I want to read Frantz Fanon after having read her work because of how clearly the brutality is shown in her work. I'm excited to read The Dragon Republic. I've been listening to the audiobook sometimes, especially if I go on a walk and I'm reading it. Yeah, I'll see how this goes. I'm a little bit more skeptical because I have heard that it gets worse, like the series gets worse. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully it stays just as great. So we'll just have to see. The Dragon Republic, guys, 6 and 45 minutes basically in. We still have like 18 hours? No. How many hours do we have left? 24 minus 8? Yeah, I don't know. We have like 18 hours left. We'll see how this goes. So I'm now like 160 pages into the book, and I did not realise that this book was not just about like the war, it was also about the fallout of the war. I was under the impression that we were just going to be like fighting the war until the end of the story. Like I thought it was going to be like one long war. But no, like we actually get some variation, and that's really fun. We get politics. It's one of like the things I really loved about Game of Thrones, the show, where it would be like episode 9 would be like the big battle sequence episode, and then episode 10 would be like the politics episode, the fallout of whatever just happened in episode 9 episode. So this kind of feels like that. There is going to be like another battle, I assume, considering there's 3 books and it's a fantasy series. I assume there's just going to be battles in every single one of these. However, I like that this is what they're going for. I like the believability of things in this series, in that a lot of the evil people are really mean, like actually like reprehensible, despicable people. That kind of like echoes the way that people who are in charge in the real world are horrible. Like, I don't know, let's say like Boris Johnson, or just like I don't know, does that give me woke vibes? Yes, I guess. But like the MPs that we have here, just who say stuff like migrants should just fuck off and die and like drown in the ocean. That is an insane thing to say about somebody who's fleeing country of war, but you know, that's kind of like the way the people in this sort of like behave.
behave and believe. So I think I like that. Like, everyone is super mean to the main character, and it kind of makes sense. Like, they'll say that she should be like her old commander, but they'll say it to her face. It's not like in a lot of other stories where it's like a self-pitying remark where she's like, I need to do better, I need to be much better, I need to be a better leader, I need to take my destiny on my shoulders, blah 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 blah. Like, they're like, you're doing a bad job, pattern up, do better, lead better. Like, to her face, like, be like your old commander, whatever you're doing now sucks. Which I find, like, just makes sense. It would make sense in this kind of scenario where they're like, you're not good at this, get better fast. Because right now you're useless to me. And that definitely is the way that people who play for power, I think, actually behave in the level of, like, evil, horrible behaviors. Also, the guy that I was like, he's definitely alive. Like, he's probably alive from the last book, the one that died. He is alive. I think he's going to be the love interest. That's kind of what the vibe I'm getting. But I also have a premonition he's going to die. Like, I don't think he's going to survive to the end of the story. I feel like, knowing that in Babel there is no love interest, like, there is, but not a real one. Not one that counts. So I just feel like maybe we won't get anything. Maybe it's just like the idea of romance and there's like nothing. But I do love a good romance subplot. So hopefully he doesn't die until like the third book, because that does keep me going sometimes. I'm like, oh, please don't die. I want you to survive. I love the way that everyone's really, really brutal. I think the brutality of everyone, the way they talk to her, they make her feel like a child. Because whilst the main character is like powerful, I like the fact that she is like a child. She's not 16 like in most YA. She is, I think, like 19. They're still like, you are so young, you are shit, and you need to be better at what you're doing. And I like that they sort of like talk down to her, and the way that she responds is very childish. She's like, why would you say this to me? Why would you expect this of me? I like that she's not explicitly naive, but instead that her flaws are things like she can't handle things, and it's asking a lot of what she knows. She doesn't have a lot of experience. I like that those things are what like weighs her down, because those are very believable. I don't know how fast I'm going to read this one, because I don't know if I like it as much. At least because we're still in the beginning part, and in the first book the beginning part is like training in the academy, and I love a good training in the academy just sort of like time. I love being in school in a book, whereas this is obviously we're straight into politics, we're straight into the action, and I feel like when you're into the action things constantly go wrong, and when things go wrong when you're straight into the action, it's always like a big consequence instead of just like, oh no, you failed the class.
Okay, I'm like 50% of the way in now, and there are lots of things I like, and there's some stuff that I don't, okay? I think the main thing is, like, it does feel like this book has a little bit of the book 2 syndrome, where major things need to start happening, and we are slowing everything down because, like, massive plot points need to sort of form, and that means it's like everything has to be a little slow. Every single thing needs to be explained, and then we're just like sort of trudging along, and that perhaps isn't what I want. I would be like, let's do the fighting. But the thing is, they're always fighting, but it's not like a big battle, but like everything is always fighting. So I don't know, it's taking some time. Time, however, even though, you know, it does piss me off that we spend all the time, you know, sort of reading like the absolute nonsensery of like everyday battle, I do think that the fact that there's so much of it, it makes like time feel really realistic. It makes, at least for me, it feels really realistic, because like the war takes ages. They're doing like sieges, they're doing battles, and they're winning, and they're like taking over like the people who are fighting. And so it feels correct because of the time. The realisticness of things does feel nice at times. Like, I like the main character's competency versus her flaws. I think they're well balanced. I think that they make her motivations and decisions actually very interesting to read about. She's not overpowered, but she's not also someone who's like a damsel. She has really good flaws, and she's really good like actual powers and talents that make everything actually work in the story. I think things like, one of her main flaws is that she really craves and seeks approval. Like, she really wants to be seen as great. She wants to be liked and needed. She doesn't like feeling useless, and I think that's really interesting for this story. Like, another thing is that she doesn't want to give up powers. I feel like this really happens to a lot of characters, where at the end they have to like sacrifice their powers for the greater good, and she just doesn't like that. I think a lot of people are like, we're at peace with giving up our powers. This could still happen. I think maybe at the end of the story, you know, this could still happen, but right now, like, there's a real struggle for like, she likes having power, and I like the idea of someone actually still wanting their power. I think power is something that's seen as like
only a bad thing. In this, I still think it's seen as only a bad thing, like in this story, but her character and the way that her character thinks, she likes her power regardless of what it needs from her to work. The thing I think I like the least, I've got a list, but it's mainly that there's one character who's sadly not with us anymore, and his impact on the entire story seems a little bit too much, considering he wasn't like very tactical. Like, he was a great character and he was very powerful, but he wasn't very clever, or at least we're told he's clever. We never see him be clever. He's sort of like losing it when we see him in the story. So I'm like, well, why are we so caught up on this character and like needing this character around when like he wasn't very useful when we did have him? He was kind of useless and losing it. So it's like it's a massive delay and issue with how they're fighting this war because of an internal battle the main character is having, and it's linked to this character who is no longer with us. And it's like, there's no need for this. He was simply not that important. Like, we can move on. Her like issue with him and not being able to do things is definitely like a manifestation of trauma, but like every other trauma is sort of like put to the side. We have to fight the war, but then like this one is there, and it just makes it seem a little silly, like that this is the main issue. It makes sense, but it feels like since everything else is happening at this massive scale, this really tiny thing that doesn't really seem at all interesting or logical in such a logical story, or at least something that's trying to be super logical, it feels really stupid and out of place, which I really don't like. So yeah, I'm 50% through. I kind of want to get to the third act. So like these books are split into part 1, part 2, part 3, and I just want to get to the third act. So like, I really don't know where this is going. I really don't know what the ending of this is really going to look like, because like, I have no idea. I don't know what this book was going to be like. It's very different from the first book in the sense of like, it's not linked in its motivations. So I don't know what the next book is about. So I don't know what that link is. So I'm just like, okay, I want to keep going, but we're still like in the middle of like everyday battles, and I know we're going to be there until at the end of part 2, which is still like, I think 150 pages away. So hopefully it gets a bit quicker, or at least like the pacing feels quicker, but I know that this is necessary for the logistics. I am now like 15 hours into reading this book. I don't feel like I'm going to finish this by 24 hours, because I only have like 2 hours left of this book, of the Dragon Republic, right? But the Burning God is going to take me like 8 hours, 9 hours to read. And I just feel like that's just not feasible. So we'll see how it goes. It might be like 26 hours, who knows? But we've got this bit, right, in the book, and it's just like infuriating because, well, I assume that this is set in China, okay? And the original ops that we faced in this story were Japan. Or like fake Japan, fake China, like, come on. And in this story, we have this like extra addition of like the West, right? They've always been here, they've always existed in this universe. Because like this world, this book's universe is essentially like our world, but like 200-300 years ago, maybe more, I don't know. Not that good at history, especially not like Chinese history. We don't have guns yet, or like China doesn't have guns yet, but there is fantasy. They don't have guns, but there is fantasy, so that's kind of like their level up. So there's like these missionaries in this story now. So the West have basically sent Christian missionaries to China to sort of try and civilize China. Okay, I keep saying China, it's Nikon. And so in this book, they're trying to do like a trade deal, and in like sort of in favor of the trade deal, they've just brought along these missionaries who are trying to like civilize the people. I hate missionaries. Like, I mean, obviously, like, back in the day, that is straight up just imperialism. Like, we still have missionaries to this day. It's pretty much just neo-imperialism. I fucking hate missionaries so much. Just, like, spreading the word of God. Like, a white person going into a space of lots of people of colour and then, like, saying that the way that they live is wrong, the things that they believe is wrong, to essentially impose Christianity onto them. It's just odd. Especially because, like, well, each missionary probably isn't a bad person. Like, I'm not saying, like, you as a missionary are a bad person, because it's like you're just a random guy, like you're just some person who's just gone to this place to try and like spread what you think is a positive thing. But it's like you're not giving out the polio vaccine, you're trying to like convert people. It's not the same, and it's just very odd. Like the practice as a whole, like all of these like maybe well-meaning people come together to just make horrible choices. And there's this bit where they're trying to like do experiments. They're trying to like learn about Chinese people, and they like make all these like notes in their book, and it really reminds me of the book Heart of Darkness, where this character like goes into I think it's Congo. I'm not sure if that's entirely right, but some sort of African country, and they essentially like go into sort of like the deepest part of it. So it's like very central. They go into a jungle. I don't know. Does Africa have I think they do. Am I chatting shit? Like, essentially, it's like a forested area, loads of trees. I'm not sure if it's a forest or a jungle. There's lots of trees, and there's like a civilization living there. And essentially, they're just like trying to say that these people are like backwards and barbarian. And it was like, it really reminds me of that book. And I hate that book. And I hate everything about missionaries and just people who go to those countries. Just like everyone who was like around in the 1700s trying to be like, I'm a scientist, I'm an explorer, and went to like places with lots of people of color just to write down things about people's like nose bridges and be like, this means this nose bridge uncivilized. What the fuck are you on about? What does that mean? It's just racism. It's just phrenology, whatever it is. Yeah, like it's just racism, straight up, eugenics based stuff. But yeah, there are all these like white people, and no offense, I hate, and like R.F. Kuang has shown me that she does not trust white people, and therefore I know they're gonna be bad people. They're like, I mean, they're already bad people, but like even in this, I'm just like, oh my god, they're horrible, they're horrible, they're horrible. I hate seeing white people. Just like let them leave, okay? Because if the Federation is Japan and like that's a whole thing, enough. Okay, why can't the ops just be Japan, bring in like Chinese infighting? I keep saying they're like real life equivalents because like it's very clear that it is, not just trying to like, because like obviously it's not true. There is such a fantasy element to it that it's like not something that I'm like, oh my god, that's so true. They're definitely like absolutely equivalents to it, but that definitely is the vibe. But yeah, it's just horrible. I hate seeing white people in this. It's kind of odd, right? Because I know a lot of fantasy. Most characters that at least I've read, I've not read a lot of fantasy with people of colour. Not that there are many that I can possibly read in English, you know, even if there are being published in countries that they're from, not here, that are like translated. But like I'm always rooting for white people. But here it's like they really kind of show you how horrible white people in the 1500s in a fantasy setting could be, because it's not like why does fantasy now mean that the racism doesn't exist? Especially because they are racist to each other. They're just like fake racism, and I'm like, no, this is real racism. And it exists, and it would exist to your stupid white people characters in your fantasy world, because apparently fantasy racism doesn't exist. But then like they make up their own types of racism so that some sort of racism can exist, and that like always just ticks me off, because I'm like, oh, shut up, stop trying to oppress white people. I hate when they try to oppress white people in their stupid fantasies. And here it's like white people are these horrible little demon people who simply are only in it for themselves, which is clearly what most European countries would have had. You know, I'm not saying like white people generally, but I mean like as a nation, were they helping out? No. And is that what happens here? Yes. I had to turn off my fan to record this, and it is so warm in here, which is so annoying. But anyway, I had a fruit shoot after like years. I have not had a fruit shoot for so long. But I ate my nephew's Happy Meal because he didn't want it, and I got to have a fruit shoot. Also, I don't think fruit shoots are this size. Did they downsize the McDonald's fruit shoot? Because this is so small. Like, what is this? This is 200 milliliters. That seems false. Anyway, I finished reading The Dragon Republic, and I don't know if I'm going to give all of my thoughts like right now, because there is just like so much going on. The main thing that I come away from this is like, I feel like people who have read this series and then chat shit about Babel in like just don't understand fiction or something. Like, are we reading in ways that are different from each other? Like, do you guys not pick up on social and political commentary if you're reading and then I do or something? Because like I remember reading Babel, and I watched near 50 reviews from people on the internet, on YouTube, and I also read like loads and loads and loads of Goodreads reviews of the book, right? Where people were essentially saying that the book felt really preachy, like it was really coming across preachy. And a lot of these people, not all of them, some of them hadn't read The Poppy War, but they were like, I really like The Poppy War, but I didn't like the preaching in this. Or, you know, they were like, I really liked Babel, but like something I didn't like was how preachy and political this was. And I was like, are you genuinely like that dense? That like I don't get it. How were you reading this book and being like, I didn't like how preachy it was about Babel? Because like the entirety of the ending of this book, right? I just realised it just looks like the sun is shining here. I'm gonna have to. The sun is still shining. I'm just gonna sit in front of it. Okay. No. Yeah, okay. And like a big thing about this book is like the last part of this book is essentially just anti-American neo-imperialism. That's entirely what it's about. This idea that if you let the West come into your country and put like military bases into your country, you become a colony of that country. Okay? Like that is literally what like basically maybe like the last sixth of the book is about. It's essentially this idea that you should not give up your autonomy to the West. It doesn't matter how bad the country gets, do not give up your autonomy to the West. And like, I can't imagine anyone reading this being like, this wasn't preachy. This was very, very clearly commentary on the world as it is now. The whole thing about missionaries that I was talking about before, and the spreading of like Christ and just religion, and this idea that because of like preaching religion and the idea of civility, like Rin has this one line where she's like, I'm so fed up of having to prove my humanity to these people. And it's like, how are people reading this and not being like, this is very, very like explicitly political? Like, what the hell? Like, I feel like it's so brutal. And I'm like, yeah, it is, but that's because like the world is. Like, this is very clearly just politics about the world. What was going on in people's minds when they were like making that connection, and they were like, no, I don't think this is very preachy and real worldy. Is the veil of fantasy really so large that people can't connect that those things exist in our world? Because this is like, okay, maybe you need to do a little bit of reading to make the like neo-imperialism, American army camp stuff like really fit together, but like everyone knows this. Like, I just can't. I don't know. I share R.F. Kuang's politics, like, basically to a T, I guess. I mean, I don't know exactly what her politics are. She's never come across and been like, I am, like, a communist, or I am, like, a socialist or anything. But, like, it's clear that she's at least some sort of leftist. But, yeah, odd that people would say that about this book. I think something that's really interesting about the entire story, like, as a whole, is that, like, none of the wars... I mean, I've not read the last book yet, but, like, none of the wars are the same. Like, we're not fighting one war. We fought 2 wars, and they've both finished. That's a spoiler. Okay, but we fought 2 separate wars so far, right? And they're not really super joined, and the next one is not really super joined, but that's like exactly how war works, you know? It's like, you know, when we went, I say we, I had no involvement in the invasion of Afghanistan, but I mean, you know, when you go in there, it's like, that's the war, and then you just keep going, because like, there's just more and more battles, because like, war is not won when like one battle is done, like war is a whole thing. I like that, like that's how this works. I feel like in a lot of fantasy battles it's like the big battle and we've won and it's over, and it's like obviously there might be more battles, but like we don't know that. Like here it's like the whole series is just like the first battle and the next battle that's like happening because of the first battle, and the next battle which is happening because of the battle that just happened, which I'm like, nice interlinking. I also like, I think the reasons that they interlink are also very good. Like I think that they're very realistic. Again, not that realism matters, but I think it adds a sense of gut-wrenching quality to the way that war actually is when all of the wars are really interlinked in this way. Like it feels very like visceral, because like all the characters that we've seen in like in the first book are also kind of in this book. We keep seeing the characters and we see how war has treated them, and it's not been like great for them. I said this like the last time I made like a comment about the book where it's like, I like how balanced her flaws are, and one of her flaws really like comes to fruition in here, and it makes like a big impact on the plot. She's like finally kind of like drawing back from this flaw. She's like, I understand why this has been a bad thing for me, and just like fueling this into a way to sort of like get better, or just like grow stronger essentially, which I think is very healthy characterization and like growth for Rin, the main character. I keep saying that throughout this video. It's like, it's Rin, the main character. I was thinking though, when I was reading this, until kind of like the very end, the characters who were like bullies in the first book sort of are kind of redeemed here. And that kind of is like flipped. Like there's like a very nice moment where you're like, oh, actually, that's not the case. Not everyone has one side to them. Everyone's got facets. Everyone has their own motivations, and I like that. It's very strong writing, I think. I don't know why people find this like that much worse. Maybe it's the next book. Maybe people don't like the next book, but I don't know why, but like I've definitely heard things where it's like the first book's the best one and the next ones perhaps aren't as great. I think I agree, and the first one is a little bit more like fast paced, but I do think this was like necessary for this book, since this book was such a battle heavy. We were like in the thick of the war. Not that the first one wasn't, we were still there, but like the war was a little bit more, not tame, but it was like the starter war. Like we're in the middle war, and then there'll be the end war, because all the wars are different. I guess you didn't know that when you're going in, but it makes sense that the wars are sort of set up in that way, because I think that's just how it works. And I feel like because of that, the second one, you know, you don't think there's going to be another war. In the first one, you're sort of like, well, okay, it's done, but like, how will we go back to normal? Like, you end that book on the sense of like, oh no, like, what's going to happen? Where are we going to go? And in the second book, you're like, okay, like, where actually are we going? Where are we going with this? Because like, this could be the last war. Like, the third book could just be like the pickup from how the war ends. But no, it's just war. Again, spoiler, that's kind of a spoiler. A little bit of a spoiler that the Poppy War series has lots of wars in it. Is that a spoiler? I don't know. It's a new day, and I'm quite a bit into reading Burning God now. I'm sort of like, I'm like nearly 50% in. I feel like in this book, we're finally getting to a point where I'm like, there are like things that were put into the story kind of like in
book one, book two, like we get told these random tidbits and you're like, well, this would be useful if anyone did anything about it. And then they're finally doing those things. Like it's taken ages and I felt like some of these things were put on the back burner, but I was like, come on guys, we should have prioritized this like last book. Like this seems like a weird place to start prioritizing it. Especially since we're like quite a bit into this book as well. I'm like, why did we not start doing this immediately? I think they're like characters where I'm like, why were we not calling on these characters to help ages ago? We are so far into this war now. I like how much everyone has to struggle, not like in a, oh, I wish characters like suffer, but it makes sense. Like everyone gets betrayed constantly, and I think that really makes sense. Like betrayals are very realistic in this kind of warfare. I think like Rin is so young and her being betrayed by like lots of different types of characters in lots of different types of ways, people that she has different types of relationships to, makes sense in like wanting to like progress. Makes sense in that like a lot of people want to just progress through the war, not just like actually get power, but survive, which I think is really nice. But yeah, we are at this point where like we're doing revolution. We're not just doing war, we're doing sort of like people-based revolution. And I am always a sucker for that. I don't know if I'll put the clip in, but I definitely took a clip of me crying when I was reading it yesterday night. I was like, I don't know if it's just because I'm emotional, but there was a point where they were like getting all the troops together and it was all like the people of Nakan, and they're coming together to like try and fight. They're not very good, but it was very sweet and nice to kind of read about revolution in that way, and sort of not that they're winning, but sort of that they're doing anything. That's anything is getting done at all is enough. Yeah, I don't know how this is going to end. Like, I don't know if we're going to see, like, obviously when we get like fantasy books, just anything, it's like we never see the end. Obviously, like the last book was clearly the fallout of a war, but I feel like this book is going to end with whatever happens in this war ending. Again, I feel like the main character is going to die. Maybe I said like another character was going to die, and I think he's definitely going to die. I just don't know where this is going. Like, I don't think we're going to see like the fallout of this war. We're just going to see like whether or not people win, and I feel like I kind of want to see what the fallout of the war is, like how they're going to rebuild the nation, because I think wars are interesting. But I've always wanted to read something where they go about rebuilding the nation after the war, and the only thing that even comes close to that I think is like King of Scars, which is the thing that happens after Shadow and Bone. But it's like, who gives a shit about what happens after Shadow and Bone? Like, that's not the greatest book series in the world. So yeah, I would love to see that if that happens here, but we're so far into this book and this war is not won, so I assume we're just going to get to whatever the end of the war is, whether this is just sort of like a sad ending where the main character dies and we all just sort of have to succumb to white colonialism in this universe, or if that means that we're actually going to get some sort of like rebuilding ideologies. But I really don't know. But yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes, but it is coming to the end, and I feel like I don't know how I feel about this book. Like, it's not that, like, it's good, but I am waning interest a little bit because it seems like we're going away from the revolution stuff and more into one person is going to win this war for us, or like we're going to use, I assume we'll come back to the revolution stuff considering R.F. Kuang is writing this book, but there is a lot of sort of like, oh, we've got important people on our side now, we might win, and it's like, okay, but that's not what I wanted from this book. Every new thing that I learn about this story and its politics, I'm like, how could anyone read this and be like, it's not preachy, it's not political? Because we literally just got to a bit, right, where we quite literally are talking about how dependent the world is on Chinese manufacturing. Like, how many sanctions we put on the East or any country where, like, America's like, that's a bit dodge. And then how much we're like, okay, we actually desperately need the manufacturing costs that we can get from there. Like, what the fuck is wrong with people? You can see me in the camera. I hate the idea of that. But like, that's so whack that people were really reading this and being like, it's not as preachy. I don't understand why anyone would say that this is preachy. Like, we're literally debates on how we bypass sanctions to make sure that we get what we need from the Chinese Communist Party, and how that is directly affecting the world like stage. I mean, it's not a direct thing in the sense of like, that's obviously not exactly what she's referencing, but it's clearly a analogy, an allegory, whichever word is correct for that situation. You know, it's one of those. And it's like, how could anyone think it's anything else? Like, you'd have to really like not be like well clued in with the news at all. So I just finished A Burning God, right? I don't know how I feel. I don't like the ending, okay? I do know how I feel about the ending. I don't like it. I just feel like it's very counter-revolutionary considering the entire themes of everything else. It's like this idea of hope and this idea of like you know, getting the community together and like rallying around each other. And like for some reason at the end of this story, that theme is just like lost. This idea that community can't and won't come together for some reason, that we have to go out in like a big sacrifice or something, like we need to sacrifice to get like a better world, which is like weird since that's like not the themes that kind of come through in the rest of this book. Like the rest of this book is kind of quite revolutionary. Like, the book just like has a lot of great ideas, and I just don't understand why this was like the hill they decided to die on. I just felt like we were giving up. It felt like all the characters and essentially the entirety of this specific book, like the last book, was unnecessary. It was as if they'd done this and then they'd gotten nowhere. Like nothing had progressed as a result of this like third war, and I was just like, that's a little dumb. It's just like, oh, we did all of this, and I'm like, okay, maybe it tells us a message, but I feel like it's not a message that's particularly interesting. Like I read another book recently that also ended exactly this way, where, you know, where there's like an idea of like martyrdom more than there is about like community effort, and I just don't think that's like very revolutionary in a story that's trying to sort of like espouse revolutionary values. And yeah, like odd place to end this, I think. Yeah, massively not into this, I have to say. It was just very, it felt like we were getting somewhere. Like we end this war and then we actually just keep going. Like the book doesn't end when the war ends, and we're like, oh look, like we're getting somewhere, it's going somewhere, it's like gonna be fine, it's gonna be interesting, and then it just doesn't become anything after that. And I just feel like that's a waste of time for us, like to read this entire book and get to that point. I think my last remarks are a little muddled and I don't want to mix anything up, so I'm gonna give my proper thoughts here. This will probably be the most spoilery part of the video, but I don't think that I'll actually spoil anything important, but like maybe be wary of this. Okay, so at some point in the video, I called this YA, and after reading all of them, it definitely isn't. I think I said this was YA because that's how it's tagged on Goodreads, and I don't think that's true anymore. The book itself is just sort of very brutal. It's a very realistic story about, you know, the harshness of war. But I do think the first book reads a lot more YA than the last two, and this is because I think Rin is younger in it and going through a school academy setting, which is much more common in YA fiction. Another thing I think that perhaps comes across as a little bit less polished and maybe makes the book, you know, maybe seem a bit more YA is the magic system. The magic is very complex, and I think at times that makes it a little weak. R.F. Kuang clearly likes a very intricate magic system, and this intricacy I think gives a really good in-world reason for why all people don't have magic. But I think that this, you know, I've said this before, is like there's no way to really learn how the magic works and how to get better at it. Like at least none of the characters in our world know how to do it, and that idea seems to be true throughout the book. But then this eventually does end up meaning in some sort of cop-outs later in the book because of the rules established beforehand. You can't really learn it, and so when people need to get more powerful, we cop out a little bit on how the magic works. Therefore, where the world building is decently dense, the magic system seems a little bit more bare bones. I think partly this is because the book generally refuses to info dump, like ever, and at least for me, that gets confusing. It takes until book 3 to get some explanations on previous wars and how to use the magic properly. We never really properly learn, but you know, which makes the third book feel a little convoluted, because I feel like we should have known these things by now. However, you know, I don't want to fault the writing too much, especially because I love the expansive characterization of the main character and how every step of the character growth makes perfect sense. This, in my opinion, like her growth is, aside from sort of, you know, the accurate historical and societal commentaries of the book, I think that it's the best part of the book. I like that Rin's flaws manifest into bigger problems. Her need for praise leads for her to like want a master, but also like a carer figure, which leads to her consistently getting screwed over. And she learns that by overcoming these things, that the world is broken, and every time she follows her craving for praise, it sets into motion a bigger problem that affects the plot. But I can't say that, you know, but she can't always overcome this, and this is the spoilery bit. She becomes super paranoid, and the way that this, you know, change ends up affecting the end of the story is very well plotted, like throughout the entire series. However, you know, I still don't really love the ending, even if it does sort of reflect the bigger themes the book is trying to convey throughout the series of cyclical nature of war. However, I think the ending also betrays the themes in the book that I personally preferred. So yeah, I finished reading The Poppy War, and honestly, it was like a 4-star experience. I think some of them were 5s, some of them were 4s. It definitely was a little bit dippy in the middle of some of the books. It also took me like way longer than I expected. Well, not way longer, but like I thought it would take me 24 hours, but you know, I wanted to finish it in 24 hours, but it took me 26.5 hours. Though, I will say, for me, I think that's pretty good, all things considered. And those are some pretty big, hefty books. So yeah, if you've made it this far and you've also read The Poppy War, I'd love to hear some people's thoughts, because ever since I finished reading them all I've been doing is like reading and watching other people's reviews. So I would love to hear if anyone's got personal opinions that clash or agree with mine. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day, and go read The Poppy War if this has made you want to read it.